Book of Proverbs is seen as a book of wisdom written by the wisest man, Solomon. The Hebrew noun translated proverb is derived from the root mashal, which means likeness. This would mean that it is a series of stories that are like something that we're experiencing, a metaphor for life, a metaphor for different things that we've been introduced to, and a metaphor for different problems in our own life. These metaphors can include an object lesson based on or using a comparison or analogy. It can be a short statement, a lesson drawn from experience, a saying or something from word. It can be an oracle of a future blessing. In this context, it is an object lesson setting out courses of action. It helps one choose the best course of action to follow. When it says the Proverbs of Solomon, that is a title, Solomon, king, the son of David, which was also an even greater title, the king of Israel, which was an even greater title. At that time, Israel was the strongest nation under Solomon's reign. So to say that you are the son of David, one of the greatest kings, the king of Israel, the greatest nation, would be to put this book as something that could be looked towards as knowledge. Solomon was known for his wisdom. Solomon was known for his great instruction. So this book would be set as something you could definitely look towards and something you could definitely follow. When it says the Proverbs of Solomon, as we mentioned before, Proverbs is something to follow. So we're following Solomon as he goes through. And basically, he gives his own wisdom that he's experienced, his own understanding and instruction. Now, there's a few things that we can see in the first few verses 1 through 6. I'm going to point out, it says to know, to perceive. In verse 3, it says to receive, to give. And verse 6, it finally says to understand. So before we even go into the book of Proverbs, we see here that we are to know, to perceive, to receive, to give subtlety, and to understand. So this is not a book of anything but knowing, perceiving, receiving, giving, and understanding. The verses 1 through 7 is its own best commentary. It's its own introduction. We are told the theme and the purpose of the book. The word proverb, as we mentioned before, is derived from the Hebrew word mashal, which means likeness. This entire book is meant for one thing, and the one thing it's meant for is instruction, giving, understanding, and receiving. We begin in verse 2, and we'll go through verse 4. It says, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man, knowledge and discretion. Simply to know that to know wisdom and to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom. Skipping down to verse 4, to give subtlety to the young man discretion. And now continuing in verse 5, it says, a wise man will hear and increase learning. A man of understanding will attain unto wise counsel. Verses 2 through 4 directly correlate to verse 5, stating that if you want to be wise, then you will hear. You will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsel. Likewise, the opposite of true, a man of fools will attain unto the counsel of fools. So therefore, if we want to gain wisdom and we want to gain understanding, we need to be with those who also want to gain wisdom and also want to gain understanding. Now, to understand, verse 6, to understand a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. Solomon has told us that to understand a proverb and the interpretation, the wise words and their dark sayings is the purpose. The reason that we read this book is to understand, not just to understand everything, but to understand specifically a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. It's really loud. It's hurting my ears. Verse 7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. As we previously mentioned, by saying that fools will attain unto the counsel of fools, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So that means that before we can actually learn anything, we need to have a general respect for and a general understanding and knowledge of the Word. How do we gain that general understanding and knowledge? Well, it would be through your own personal study. To receive and to have knowledge, you must first contemplate and gain knowledge. And you can only do that by first searching for it. And how do you search for it? Well, searching the Scriptures. The second half of verse 7 says, "But fools despise wisdom and instruction." Verse 5 says, "A wise man will attain unto wise counsel." Verse 7 directly supports that argument by saying fools despise wisdom and instruction. So that would mean that if somebody claims they are wise, and yet they do not constantly gain more knowledge and they do not constantly learn new things, they themselves are not wise. They might have a lot of knowledge, yes. They might have a lot of wisdom, yes, but they are not wise. Solomon would be considered one of the wisest men to ever walk the face of the earth. He had his wisdom straight from God, but just because he was wise does not mean he was not a fool. You see, he had everything, yet he threw it all away for the worldly things. He threw it all away because he loved the world rather than the love of the spiritual. So, to be wise and to have wisdom and to be seen as someone who is wise, you need to be humble, you need to have the Christianly attributes, yes, but you also need to be with the counsel of the wise. See, the statement, "Fools despise wisdom and instruction," is not just a statement, but it is a title as well. And that's why calling someone fool back in the day was such a big thing, because this was a serious thing. This wasn't something that, oh, you're a fool, but it was, you're a fool, and now you're labeled as such. The word despise here doesn't mean that you just don't like it. It means you actively seek out ways to not interact with it. We ourselves are supposed to despise sin, are supposed to despise all these evil things, which means that we don't let it sit, but we push it out of the room, we make it leave. So in this instance, this fool, not only is he despising wisdom and instruction, but he makes sure it's nowhere near him. He makes sure that he's always around the counsel of fools because he himself wants to be a fool. In the same sense, this would be someone who knows something is wrong, but they won't be with people that'll tell them it's wrong because they don't want to know. Continuing in verse 8, and we'll also read verse 9 with this, it says, "My son, hear the instruction of thy father, and forsake not the law of thy mother. For they shall be an ornament of grace unto thy head, and chains about thy neck." Here plainly it says to obey your mother and your father, and if you do so, you'll have grace. If you do so, it'll look very good on you. I remember being a child and always thinking that I knew better than my parents. Now, I'll never admit this to them, even though they're in the room now, but I always remember thinking that I knew better because in my childish mind, I thought I was wise. I thought I was so smart, only for my plans to fail. But if I had just listened to my parents, things would have gone very differently. Now, I can't think of a singular example because I was always very, very obedient, but I'm sure there was one. You'll have to ask them later. It says, "Instruction of thy father, and forsake not the law of thy mother." This does not mean that you're supposed to only listen to your father when it comes to instruction, and you're only supposed to listen to your mother when it comes to rules. What it means is they are a unit, they are one flesh, so this could be translated as seen as parents or vice versa. "Hear the instruction of thy parents, and forsake not the law of thy parents." So this does not give excuse to say, well, my father didn't say to sweep, so I'm not going to sweep. And this does not also give excuse to say, well, my mother did not say to do this, so I'm not going to do this. This would mean just don't forsake the law of thy... Well, this would basically give the reason to obey your parents at all times, no matter the juncture, no matter what they're giving you, whether it's the law of thy father, instruction of thy mother, or the instruction of thy father and law of thy mother. Verse 9, when it says there will be an ornament of grace unto thy head and chains about thy neck, those were very beautiful items to be wearing back in Solomon's time. Those were things that were high in value and high in honor, high in anything you could imagine. It would be like the nicest suit, the nicest necklace, the nicest jewelry. Basically, If you followed your parents, your life would be beautiful. If you followed your parents, your life would be worth something. So then it begs the question of why wouldn't you follow your parents? Well, as was previously stated with my personal example, we think we're smarter. We think we're better. Now, I know there's not very many children in here, but it still applies. No matter the circumstance, the instruction of thy father and law of thy mother are things that are beautiful to behold and beautiful to be kept. Continuing in verse 10, and verse 10 through 19 all convey the same idea. It's worthwhile to mention that back in the Jewish times, they didn't rhyme like we do. Like if we say bat and cat, they don't rhyme like that. They like to rhyme ideas rather than actual words. So tree is to leaf as baker is to bread. It would be more of a poetic thing and less of a hip-hop, kind of rhyme of the words thing. So as we go through this, just remember that this is not supposed to be like a rhyming thing in the sense of words. It's rhymes rather in the sense of an idea that's being conveyed to translate into another idea that's being conveyed, but they both have the same, they both have the same general idea, and they both convey the same thing. Continuing in verse 10, it says, My son, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not. If they say, Come with us, let us lay in wait for blood. Let us lurk privily for the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them up alive as the grave, and whole as those that go down into the pit. Let's stop right there and we'll notice a couple of things. First off, it says, My son, if sinners entice thee. So it's still talking to the son. It's still talking to those that are young. If they say, Come with us, let us lay in wait for blood. Let us lurk privily for the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them up alive as they go to the grave, whole as those that go down into the pit. A very enticing situation this young man has been put in, where he wants to lay in wait, he wants to sabotage, but at the same time, you're not supposed to do that because of the Christianly values that we have been set forth. Now, the enticement comes from these next few verses. Verse 13, continuing, it says, We shall find all precious substance, we shall fill our houses with spoil, cast in thy lot among us, let us all have one purse. Now, the enticement does not necessarily come from lying in wait and seeking out blood. The enticement would come from, You shall find all the precious substance and fill our houses with spoil. So, in this sense, the enticement that this young man is going through would be the material. If we lay in wait, we can gain all this. If we lay in wait, we can have all this. If we lay in wait, you can have everything you've ever wanted. So the enticement comes from the physical wants, being willing to take something from someone else just so you can have something. Being willing to not only sabotage and ruin someone else's entire life, but willing to take it from them just so you can have something. Verse 14 says, Cast in thy lot among us. Let us all have one purse, which means they would share all the spoil. So that would mean that no one's going to get left out. We're all going to have something. In a sense, this would seem like the context of not only physical want, but also physical need. Instead of going out and working for something, you're instead going to take it from someone else who's worked for it, so that way you can do things the easiest possible way. And the thought of sharing one purse would also mean that you don't even have to do anything. You can just sit there and wait, let other people handle it, and you can get your own. You can get a part of it even if you don't partake. You can get something even if you've done nothing to spill blood, even if you've done nothing to ruin. You can still have something. But if a man does not work, let him also not eat bread. If a man does not work for what he gets, why then should he get anything at all? If you've done nothing to gain something, why should you get anything at all? Well, that's the idea. That's the enticement, is having or getting to do nothing and yet still getting to gain something, which would then beg the question of, why should we try to do things the easiest possible way when there might be a negative outcome? Well, we shouldn't. if there's a chance that someone else can be affected, if there's a chance that we ourselves can ruin someone else's life, can affect someone else's life in a negative way, why should we then do things the easiest possible way and yet hurt them? When here it says, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not. Verse 12, let us swallow them up alive as they go to the grave, and whole as they go down into the pit. What a terrible thought. And to think that people would do this just because they want something. The want of something rather than the need of something. Well, yes, you might be trying to fulfill basic needs. There's better ways to go about this than stealing. There's better ways to go about this than cheating someone out of their own needs. What sense does it make to hurt someone just so you can gain something, when in the long run, all you're really doing is hurting yourself spiritually? It doesn't. It makes no sense. Continuing in verse 15, it says, my son, walk not thou in the way of them with them. Refrain thy foot from their path, for their feet run to evil and make haste to shed blood. Surely in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird, and they lay wait for their own blood. They lurk privily for their own lives. The idea that we previously stated of hurting yourself spiritually by hurting others physically is conveyed here. The people that walk in the path that waits for blood, and the people that make haste to evil, in turn shed their own blood. Not physically, they're not running around and cutting themselves, but what they're doing is condemning their own souls, shedding their own blood spiritually. Verse 17 says, in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird. I don't know if you've ever tried to catch a bird. I know I have. But when you throw a net on a bird, and if the net has holes in it, the bird's going to fly away. That's just a known fact. And the same even is if you dive for the bird's going to fly away before you can ever grab it, which I never understood, but I learned that birds have like the 360 vision, so that makes more sense. But if you've ever tried to catch a bird, it doesn't go very well. And usually you exhaust yourself running after this bird, shouting for it to come back maybe, trying to climb a tree, falling out of the tree, not telling anyone because you're embarrassed. But it's very difficult to catch a bird, and if you keep trying and you keep running after this bird, you're going to eventually exhaust yourself. Verse 18 says, and they lay in wait for their own blood. They lurk privily for their own lives, which means that spiritually, they will die. If they continue on this path, they will not live on it. They will die on it. Verse 19 says, so are the ways of everyone that is greedy of grain, which taketh away the life of the owners thereof. Same idea is conveyed. Those that are greedy, those that want, those that need, those that desire to have more than anybody else, they will die in that way. If they continue in the way of I want, thinking only of themselves, they will die in that way. And the same is true for us. If we continue in a way that is all-consuming, all I want, I need, I want, can I have, can I get, we will die in that way. It is a very, very slippery slope to be climbing on, because not only can you fall, but you can fall hard. And when you fall hard, you see yourself. And when you see yourself, you see what you've done. You see the things that you've committed, all the people that you've hurt possibly. If we live with the attitude of I instead of the attitude of we or what can I do, an I that is selfish, if we continue down that way, we will die in that way. And that is not a comforting thought. A comforting thought is we can change from that way. A comforting thought is we can walk off the path of selfish I and be on a more righteous path of a we, a more righteous path of a selfless I. But it all depends on what you would rather prefer. Would you rather prefer to be comfortable for eternity or uncomfortable for eternity? I don't know about you. You don't need to raise your hand or you have your question, but I would rather be comfortable for eternity. And if that means being uncomfortable for this physical life, I would much rather take being uncomfortable here than being uncomfortable for eternity. And yes, that might mean that we need to sacrifice some things. That might mean that we need to get rid of some things. But nevertheless, if we get rid of something here, we gain something there. And I would much rather lose everything here and gain everything up there. Continuing in verse 20, it says, wisdom crieth without. So this is a stopping. This is a different idea that's being conveyed. We've seen how we need to stay away from sin and enticement. Now wisdom is crying. Start at verse 20. Wisdom crieth without. She uttereth her voice in the streets. She crieth in the chief place of concourse. In the openings of the gates. In the city she uttereth her words, saying, how long, ye simple ones, will ye love simplicity? And the scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. Turn you at my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit unto you. I will make known my words unto you, because I have called, and ye refused. I have stretched out my hand, and no man regardeth. In this instance, wisdom, she's crying out. That means that wisdom is not something that you can miss. Wisdom is everywhere. Wisdom is something that is very commonplace, very common sense. It's not hidden. So then, why wouldn't you accept it? Well, that's because wisdom conflicts with what you want. I remember being younger and thinking, I would really like this thing. And I was doing this thing, and then it started to conflict with my Christian values. And being the wise young man that I was like, well, I'm just not going to be a Christian anymore if it's going to conflict. Now, that was the wrong attitude to have. That was something that I did have. And that was because I decided that I was going to have foolishness over wisdom, because foolishness was, at the time, better in my eyes than wisdom was. When in reality, if I looked at the situation and thought, well, maybe I need to stop this thing because it's hurting me. Maybe I need to stop this thing because it's pulling me away from everyone. Because in reality, the longer that I kept doing this thing, the more miserable I became. The more that I was doing this, and the longer that it kept up, the more I felt like, man, the world sucks, and I don't like it. When in reality, it was my own doing. When in reality, if I had just taken a step back and thought about the situation from wisdom instead of from foolishness, I would have seen this act that I'm doing is causing me a lot of inner turmoil, and I need to stop. Which we can do a lot today. We can do something and convince ourselves that this is a good thing. We can do something and convince ourselves that we need to keep doing this because it's fun or because we enjoy it. When in reality, just because we enjoy something and we feel like it's a good thing doesn't necessarily mean that it is a good thing. In our eyes, yes, it might seem like the greatest thing in the world and nothing can ever compare to this thing. But in reality, not our own feelings, we see that this is hurting me and I need to stop. Continuing in verse 21, she crieth again. She crieth in the chief place of concourse, in the openings of the gates. In the city she uttereth her words, saying, how long, ye simple ones, will you love simplicity? And the scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. Again, we see she's crying in the opening. She's crying in the gates. She's crying out where people can see, where people can hear. She's crying, how long, ye simple ones, will you love simplicity? She's crying, how long will you scorners delight in scorning and fools hate knowledge? She's reproving. She's telling these people, turn away. She's begging with them. She wants them to turn away. And yet, we see in verse 25, it says, but ye have set it not all my counsel, and would none of my reproof. I will also laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your fear cometh. When your fear cometh as desolation, and your destruction cometh as a whirlwind, then shall all they call upon me, but I will not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find me. We'll stop right there and notice a few things. The first thing we see is that wisdom has had enough. So we see that wisdom has a limit. We see that there is a point in time when wisdom will turn away. We see there is a point in time when we will call, but wisdom will not answer. We will call, but there will just be laughs. We will call, it will just be quiet. What a scary thought. Why would you take the risk when the reward is so much greater? Why would you risk being foolish for all your life and just repenting at the end when you don't know when the end is? Why would you take that risk? Now we see here, this is a great humiliation. This is a great embarrassment. To be laughed at by wisdom herself. To be mocked. To be desolated by wisdom herself. When in the light, we could have been side by side with wisdom. We don't need to be laughed at. We don't need to be mocked. We don't need to be desolated. But because we lived for once, because we lived for foolishness instead of wisdom, we are laughed at. We are mocked. We are desolated. We are embarrassed. And it is all because we decided to live foolishly. We decided to live from an emotional, I want standpoint instead of a wisdom, selfless I standpoint. We lived for self physically instead of living for self spiritually. Continuing in verse 29, it says, "For they hated knowledge, which is a sign of foolishness, and they did not choose the fear of the Lord, which is another sign of foolishness. They would none of my counsel. They despised all my reproof, which is another sign of foolishness. Therefore shall they eat of the fruit of their own way, and be filled with their own devices. For the turning away of the simple shall slay them, and the prosperity of fools shall destroy them." We saw earlier in verse 22, it says, "How long, ye simple ones, will you love simplicity?" And here it says, "For the turning away of the simple shall slay them." So we see here that there is, in fact, a way to act that can destroy you. And we've already seen that is the way of foolishness, yes, but the way of the simple. Now, what would the way of the simple mean? Well, it would mean the person who's very dogmatic in their approach to things. The person who does the bare minimum of what they're supposed to do just so they can get by. And when you have that attitude towards life, and you have that attitude towards God, just doing the bare minimum, just showing up because you're supposed to be there, just being there because everybody else is going to be there and I don't want to look bad. What does God think? Yes, man and their thoughts are important, but what really matters is what does God think? You might show up and people might think, good for you, but God knows your intentions. God knows your heart. And if you're showing up just because you need to be there, what purpose does it have? Except being simple. Except being another characteristic of foolishness. They despised all my reproof. They would none of my counsel. We said earlier that to be wise, you must have counsel with the wise. And if you're showing up just to show up, whose counsel are you really with? If you're showing up just because you need to be here, just because it's commanded, but not because you have a serious desire or want to be here, what kind of counsel are you giving? Yes, you might be with the counsel of the wise, but just because you're with the counsel of the wise does not mean you yourself are wise. How you act determines how you're characterized. Just because you decide, I'm going to go to church because these people are good people, doesn't mean you yourself are a good person. Not to say anybody here is a bad person, but there is the notion of, why are you here? What purpose does it have with you being here? Do you want to be here? Are you here because you have a deep and unquenchable love for God? Are you here because, well, it's Sunday? Where else would I be? What else would I be doing? When you're here, what is your mindset? Do you think, well, I'm really tired. I wish I could be asleep right now. I know I've been guilty of that, and that's just something that's human nature. But there's a difference between having that thought on an off Sunday and having that thought every Sunday. There's a difference between wanting to be here and feeling like you need to be here. Feeling like you need to be here because maybe your parents are here. Feeling like you need to be here because your friends are here. Feeling like you need to be here simply because it's tradition. There was the tradition of the Pharisees. They held their traditions in high standards. But Christ called them an unclean cup that was washed on the outside, yet dirty on the inside. The outside appearance looked really nice, but on the inside, they were nothing but sinners. When we're here today, do we have a simple mindset? I want you to really think about this. I want you to really, really think about it. What is your mindset? Truthfully ask yourself, what is my mindset? Is it a simple mindset, or is it a mindset of wisdom? Is it a foolish mindset, or is it a mindset of righteousness? Because there is a big difference, and there is a big purpose for being here. And finally, the last verse of chapter 1, verse 33 says, "But whosoever hearkeneth unto me shall dwell safely, and shall be quiet from fear of evil." You see, it starts off with an introduction, then it goes to despise evil, then it goes to when you don't, you'll be mocked, and then it ends with a comforting thought. It ends with peace. "Those who hearken unto me shall dwell safely, and shall be quiet from fear of evil." So even though you once did this thing, even though you were once this person, even though you were once this type of way, you can have peace. You can dwell safely. And you can be quiet from fear of evil. Quietness is often looked at as the same as peace. When people say it's quiet, that can oftentimes mean it's peaceful. When people say, "I just need to be alone," that's usually because they need some quiet time. They need some peace. I have 2 younger siblings. I know a lot about quiet time. And I know a lot about when it's quiet, there is in fact peace. I definitely know my mother thinks so. But in a spiritual sense, when your mind is quiet, when there is serenity in your mind, there is peace. And here we see that if we follow wisdom and we follow instruction, we can also have peace. We can also have assurance to know that we can dwell safely and don't have to live with the fear of evil. Well, yes, we're supposed to despise evil. We also sometimes fear it. And we can despise something and at the same time fear it. We can despise something and at the same time be so scared of it that oftentimes we just don't acknowledge it. Well, I'm here to tell you that the fear of evil can be done with. You can have peace. You can have that quietness, but only if you live through wisdom. And not just anybody's wisdom, but God's wisdom. Man's wisdom will get you nowhere. Man's wisdom will not give you peace, will not give you quietness. You will not dwell safely if you follow man's wisdom. The only wisdom you can truly follow and truly be safe and truly have peace is God's wisdom. Now, before we continue to chapter 2, does anyone have any question, comments, or concerns? Any revelations or wonderful oppositions? No? Okay. Continuing in chapter 2, it says, "My son, if thou wilt receive my words and hide my commandments with thee," which means hide them in your heart, keep them on your mind, "so that thou incline thine ear unto wisdom and apply thine heart to understanding, if thou criest after knowledge and liftest up thy voice for understanding, if thou seek her silver and searchest for her as for hid treasures, then thou shalt fear the Lord, the God, and find the knowledge of God." We saw in chapter 1 that The beginning of knowledge is the fear of the Lord, or the fear of the Lord is the beginning of understanding. And here we're told how to obtain that fear of the Lord. We can have understanding, but first it says we must receive the words, hide commandments in our hearts, incline our ear to wisdom, apply thy heart to understanding, cry as for knowledge, which means actively seeking for it, actively looking for it, lifted up thy voice for understanding. That means wanting to understand, not being dogmatic and, well, if the preacher said it, then it's true, but searching, wanting to know, wanting to make sure, wanting to fully understand a certain subject for yourself. Verse 4 has a really interesting parallel. Seeking her as silver and searching for her as for hid treasures. Now this would convey the idea of something precious. Treasures and silver are precious metals. If there was a treasure in a field and you had that field and you were told, dig in it as much as you want, if you find that treasure, you can keep all of it. I don't know about you, but I would search for that treasure. If I knew that it was something of value, I would be out there every day from sun up to sundown, digging as much as I could, trying to find this treasure, because I know once I find it, I will be happy. Wisdom is the same way. That's the first bell. All right. Wisdom is the same way. We search for it. We desire after it. And we don't stop till we find it. And yes, that does mean forever. That does mean your life. Because we should be constantly learning, should be constantly growing as imperfect men. And I don't mean that in any kind of mean way. We can never be perfect. We strive for it, but that striving means constant. But that striving does not mean we get a little better, then we stop. That striving means we get a little better, then we get a little better, then we get a little better, and it continues. Until we shed this physical body, it continues. The word striving does not mean I'll search for it, but if I don't find it in the first 15 seconds, I'm done. That striving means continuous. That striving means that we keep going even when times get hard. We keep going even when situation seems bleak. We keep going even when opposition comes our way. Verse 5 says, let me finish this thought real quick. Verse 5 says, then thou shalt understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. We've already conveyed this idea that if we do all these things, if we keep wisdom and we search after this wisdom like it were a hidden treasure in a field, we shall obtain the fear of God. We shall find the knowledge of God. I'll leave you with this. The wisdom of God and the knowledge of God only comes from the fear of God. And we only obtain the fear of God through his wisdom. So let's make sure we follow that. Let's make sure that before we try to trust our own judgment, we first trust God's judgment. Thank you. Thank you. You guys are dismissed, I guess. Yes, sir?
Well, not really a question. I just think it's interesting in the book of Proverbs, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom is always denoted as a female.
Yeah.
It's not, I know it's a boy, but it's not like anthropos. It's not mankind.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. It's more, I would think, I don't know this for certain, so don't quote me on this, but I would say that we behold women as something beautiful, and so wisdom is meant to be seen as something beautiful, whereas men, we don't often call them beautiful. I mean, I guess you could. I feel like that would be a little weird, but we oftentimes see women as something that's very beautiful, very attractive, very desirable, I guess. But we oftentimes see women as something beautiful, something pretty, something precious. And in the same way, wisdom is those same three things: beautiful, precious, pretty. All right. I assume that was the second bell.